History Spotlight, brought to you by HEC Media and the Missouri Historical Society.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jody Sowell, president of the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, and this is History Spotlight. In 1905, a group of Mexican revolutionaries arrived in St. Louis, intent on ousting Mexican President Porfirio Diaz from power. Known as the St. Louis Junta by the local press, this group of radicals published a newspaper, established a political party, raised an army, and helped spark the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Teen programs and adult tours manager Ryan Deloche shares their story.
In the early 1900s, the St. Louis press became obsessed with a group of local Mexican revolutionaries led by the anarchist writer and journalist Ricardo Flores Magón. Nicknamed the Scorpion because of the sting of his pen, Flores Magón was one of the most outspoken critics of Mexican President Porfirio Diaz. Diaz ruled Mexico with an iron fist for decades and squashed dissent with a network of spies and armed henchmen known as Rurales. And after years of imprisonment and suppression in Mexico by the Diaz regime, Flores Magón, his younger brother Enrique, and this small group of Mexican dissidents fled to the U.S., first settling in Texas before moving further north to St. Louis. In St. Louis, Flores Magón and the St. Louis Junta worked quickly to build a social movement against the Diaz regime. They restarted their newspaper, Regeneración, which had been outlawed in Mexico, reaching nearly 20,000 subscribers across the U.S. and Mexico, and created a political party to challenge Diaz, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, commonly known as the PLM. Within 2 weeks of its founding, the PLM's office in St. Louis was raided, and Flores Magón and the other leaders of the PLM were arrested. After being released on bail, they jumped bond, fled St. Louis, and began to live life on the run. During the raid, the sheriff and local Mexican consul seized the newspaper's printing press and confiscated the files from the PLM office. Reading through the files, it became clear that the PLM wasn't just a political party. It was a revolutionary force intent on overthrowing the Mexican government. With its leadership on the run, the PLM continued its efforts in St. Louis, publishing a 52-point platform in 1906, promising to redistribute economic and political power and ignite a revolution in Mexico. Over the next 2 years, the PLM conducted several armed raids into Mexico, but the revolution they hoped for didn't materialize until 1910. Francisco Madero, whose donation had helped restart Regeneración in the United States, led the charge in the north of Mexico. Longtime Regeneración subscriber Emiliano Zapata led the fighting in the south, carrying flags with Regeneración's motto, Tierra y Libertad, or Land and Liberty, into battle. Together, they helped oust Diaz from power, and in 1917, Mexico adopted a new constitution, which was inspired by many of the ideas laid out in the PLM platform. Flores Magón never returned to Mexico. In 1907, he was captured by a St. Louis detective, Thomas Furlong, in Los Angeles, and he spent the rest of his life in and out of U.S. prisons, eventually dying in Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas in 1922. While his story has largely been forgotten in St. Louis, Flores Magón and his fellow revolutionaries, known today as Magonistas, are widely celebrated across Mexico for their role in sparking the Mexican Revolution.
Next on History Spotlight, the first crematory west of the Mississippi was right here in St. Louis.
To learn more about the Missouri Historical Society, visit mohistory.org.